against it. Obviously, the Scots were closely split as well. But there's just no evidence that this is somehow morally problematic, it seems to me. And worth noting that that case is also tremendously interesting and important precisely because not only the Scots, but the British as a whole, of course, approved the referendum, allowed it to happen, and then contested it as politics, right? Which is the kind of response, my argument differs from that in some ways, but it's definitely very much modeled on the Scottish and Quebecois cases in terms of the kinds of things that a state ought to do if they were to apply the model I'm suggesting. It's very similar to those in terms of the willingness to open this question and then to contest it as politics. Because it's perfectly fine, as the British did, to say, we don't want you to leave. We're going to argue for your staying, but not by denying the possibility. And as I think I've written an op-ed in the LA Times on the question of California's secession, and this is very much the line I take. I personally would be opposed to it if the vote came and I had a chance to vote. I'd vote against it because I value the shared relationship between the rest of the country and California. But I think it makes sense to allow the possibility if enough Californians, for almost any reason, wanted to leave, they should have the right to do it, and then we should vote. And even though I myself would probably not vote for that, under current circumstances, I think we ought to accept the outcome, just as we do with any election.
That's a perfect transition. I want to read a quote from the article about Calexit you wrote in November 2016. Quote, "I'm not sure I'm patriotic about anything, but if I were, it would be California."
Yeah, my wife and my friends who know me will notice that I'm like a default California patriot's not quite the right word, but I'm very much a Californian in my mind, which is why I wrote that article in the way that I did. I still identify with the place I grew up in very important sort of emotional ways, which are something like love of country or patriotism. Although I don't incline to those terms in general, but I have some sort of connection to the land, as it were. Even though I've lived in a long time.
And I also recall in that article you saying that you had been in Indiana for about a decade.
Yeah, a little more.
But you did not. Yeah, but you didn't consider yourself a Hoosier. You've been in this place for 10 years, and you still kind of acted and thought like a Californian. Does that suggest there is a distinct California culture that's significantly different from American culture?
First of all, I note that I believe technically I can't be a Hoosier if I wasn't born here, but there's some debate about that. But the point is more general. You got it quite right. I still feel this connection there. I don't know if I would go that far. In a qualified way, of course, California is different in some respects from other parts of the country, as many other parts are. So we could speak of that as a unique culture. But if we were to, I think we'd also want to acknowledge that the overlaps between that culture and the one in the rest of the country are very profound, right? So it might be well true that it's more similar than it is different, it seems to me. But I want to press a different point. To me, the question of whether the culture is different or not is the kind of thing that might inform someone's decision how to vote if we were to decide the question. But for me, it is in no way a thing that decides it for anyone else. So it might be your reason, sure, but what it isn't, and this I think is important because many people who talk about the reasons why we might allow a secession look for objective reasons, as they imagine. Is there a different culture? Is there a different ethnic group or something? Is there a distinct, definable level of suffering that we ought to remedy? And part of my argument in the book is we need to get away from all of that. No one can agree on the objectives. Is California different? So that's why it's a great question for this purpose. Is it a different culture? I don't know. You can say it is, quite plausibly, with a straight face. You could deny that totally. The point, though, is if people there were to feel that and to feel it in enough of a way as a salient enough question that they wanted to be a separate society because of it, I think we ought to respect that. At that point, there'd be no purpose in anyone saying, well, you realize, of course, it's not true, right? That would be, again, I use the example of an election. That would be like saying to people, we know you voted for candidate X, but it doesn't really make any sense. There's that book a few years ago, What's the Matter with Kansas, right? I've always thought it was a profoundly misguided enterprise because and I mentioned this in the symposium that I just wrote in, you can do all the studies you want to demonstrate that people in Kansas are voting against their objective interests, but that's the way they're voting, and each election we need to take account of that. So it's a fascinating sort of social scientific question, and even a political one, but it's not the basis for evaluating and approving or disapproving people's decisions. People in Kansas vote the way they do. And if Californians ever were to express a desire for independence, I think that that's the thing we'd have to use as our basis for negotiating, and not whether they had a culture that was different or a legitimate set of excuses or reasons, a train of abuses or something like that. That's why I advocate what I call a thin procedural model of secession based solely on a referendum, so that we have the data from an election that tells us that people in an area that they've defined have voted in some majority in favor of this proposition. And all the other things about culture, historical claims, human rights abuses, if it came to that, all of those things are, shall we say, the reasons in the politics that make up their decision. But they're not themselves the reasons why we ought to respect their choice. So I want to look at this as a really radical decision of political desire, and not something based on objective claims. That's why I find cases like Quebec and Catalonia and Scotland so interesting, because no one can plausibly suggest that these people need this as a matter of persecution, preventing persecution or human rights or anything like that. If these people make a claim, it's because they desire it. Right? If we respect their claim, it's because we respect their political desire, and that would be true for California as well. So with all the heated rhetoric of red and blue aside, California is a place comfortably integrated into the American experience, participating in our society with wealth, with all the problems and the advantages. And if it wanted to separate it, it's something that we ought to respect because it's what Californians wish, and not because they've met some checklist of suffering.
Well, let's get right into that. I'm going to start a new segment real quick, and this is the